Welcome to Sollu Kaburz podcast, and today's topic was born out of an Instagram interaction, actually. So, Aidan has been a guest on this podcast. We did one during the last US election. Aidan, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for doing this, man.
Absolutely.
So, this topic was born because I had posted a story on Instagram saying that the public transport of America kind of sucks, to be blunt. And to which Aiden responded with very interesting facts and figures of how it sucked and how it could have been and how it was and where it has come to. So I thought that would make a really good topic to talk about. And along with that, we'll talk about the car culture of America and so on. So Aiden, thank you again for doing this. So just continuing our conversation on the Insta from where we left off, right? So we have to take it from the bottom for people who are uninitiated, right? I mean, obviously there are a lot of Indians living in America, but there are a lot of uninitiated people who think of America as this wonderful utopian dreamland where everything is so easy and comfortable, but it is not exactly easy and comfortable when it comes to public transport, right? So what is notorious about it among the cities that has public transport and among the really famous cities that don't even have an inch of a public transport? So what is notoriously bad about them?
Absolutely. So, first off, I just say that in general, I think urban history in America is really a kind of discipline of understanding how the country came to develop the way it did, why the country looks the way it does now. It's often usually neglected in the mainstream. And I think that that's a big mistake because I think a lot of the way the United States developed its cities, especially in the last 100 years, is intimately related to how the United States developed in social matters and really just in everything, really. Just, I mean, the most obvious example is just the way racial prejudice has obviously created massive, informal segregation in cities, well past segregation being formally banned by the federal
Mm,
government, and how that persists to this day. I'd say also something with America that's very interesting, and I think it's illuminating in some ways, is if you look at the top 10 largest cities in America.
mm,
And I think that's interesting for a variety of reasons because in the average country, if you look at the 10 largest cities, it correlates pretty well with what the most well known cities are. In India, it is,
yeah.
obviously there's been big shifts in the last 100 years. Like Bangalore is much larger than it was a century ago. Kolkata is comparatively smaller, but obviously Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, they generally, in terms of demographics, their very large populations do correlate with outside perception. But in America, one of the weirder parts of this country is that cities are, if you ever look at a map of an American city, there's such a bizarre discrepancy in what they look like. So in Los Angeles, for example, you have large swathes of LA and LA County that aren't part of the city.
Mm,
They're considered part of the community, but they're not formally within the boundaries. And the explanation for this is every state governs its own laws with regards to this. And for a variety of reasons, some cities have kind of pushed to incorporate outside
mm,
communities and some haven't. But within the context of this conversation, I think it's important because a lot of the 10 largest cities in America, places like Phoenix, Arizona, really only became huge in the last 100 years. And the significance of that with regard to car culture is that these cities developed while cars were becoming the dominant mode of transportation. LA
mm,
became a major city at the turn of the 20th century because of the local oil boom. And that turned
mm,
into car manufacturers lobbying against public transportation. And yeah, so in that sense, a lot of America in the last 100 years is so much of it does relate to really exclusionary urban planning that is really preferences cars above all other forms of transportation. So you have a arrangement where you're in a city, a place with over 1 million people, but it
mm,
doesn't really feel like a city in a conventional sense. Most of these places, Phoenix, Arizona, it is one-story buildings with 5 lanes of cars.
Hmm.
in between them with endless concrete to walk on without even seeing a tree. And so much of it really is just indicative of a lot. I mean, I'll, let you ask more specific questions, but I think
Right.
that this is why I'd like to interrogate it. I'm, at the risk of going off on a tangent, and I should have been a little bit more direct when making
That's
this
fine.
perhaps, but yeah, a lot of it is just so kind of untouched upon, when I think
Hmm.
it's so fundamental to understanding the last 100 years is urban planning.
So right, and you give such a detailed answer, but I still want to start with the basics, right? So, uh, why do we get a sense that you need a car in America to survive in general, right? So, do you feel that as a young person who is starting out, probably may or may not be able to afford a car, are cars deliberately made so affordable that everyone has to like flock to them? So, why is it that we need cars so badly, even to go to a grocery store? What is the structure of an American city, right? Because I have been told that there is a downtown in the center and there are suburbs all around, and there'll be a Walmart for every suburb. But like, so how is this entire structure of an American city planned for the cars, by the cars, with the cars, if I'm not wrong?
No, it's completely correct. And people will, push back and kind of demand that more nuance is given. But no, it's true. If you don't have a car, it's miserable. If you go, forgive me for using miles because, America, we have funny units of measurement. But just as an example, I'm in California. And even though California was built to accommodate car culture, we still do have better public transportation than most places outside of New York, just because we're a democratic state and
Mm,
blue states give a little bit more funding than places like Texas where bus services get next to nothing.
yeah.
And what's really funny is when I use a Maps app, and I have to drive, unfortunately, and I was looking not even that far of a distance, and I was using my Google Maps app. I looked down and I saw this distance within my same county. It said that to get from point A to where I needed to be, it said 2 hours and 20 minutes. And I was like, what do you mean 2 hours and 20 minutes? And I looked and I saw, oh no, that's the tab for public transportation, i.e.
Yes.
buses or Metrolink. When you go to cars, it says 20 minutes. And like I said, California is not even remotely close to being the worst offender in this regard. It's
Mm,
better at the very least. And yeah, and to even before getting into kind of the broader topic, one of the issues is it's so deeply difficult to build public transportation systems when you've already created a layout for a city designed for cars, like i.e. when you build a massive human settlement and every block is just single family 2-story homes as opposed to apartment buildings. You can fund buses as much as you want. It's just really going to be limited when you've already built that, as opposed to building something like New York.
mm.
And I'd say, just to start off, in the sense of understanding kind of where American attitudes towards cars came about, I think it's just really important to understand America and go back to its settler colonial roots as a country where people think of America as like a tabula rasa, like endless land. Even before America expanded out west, people thought that there was just like endless frontier. That's where you get the classic of, I don't know if it has the same connotation in India as the classic saying of, how Americans just want to have a nice house with a white picket fence. But
Yeah.
that's always such a deeply ingrained attitude towards, and what Americans see as the ideal living situation.
American
And when you
dream.
have exactly, and when you have no real natural borders in going into the development of America, meaning, 19th century, where America was only half the size as it was now. We weren't west past of the Mississippi River. California and Washington, all these, they generally didn't have any European settlements at that time. They were
Mm,
native lands. And at the time, people saw it sort of as an endless frontier. And, in that sense, it cars kind of just got ingrained slowly and surely, and it's simplistic to say, but there is really an ingrained sentiment that cars are the expression of freedom and that public transportation is degenerate. And that is an attitude that definitely exists elsewhere. It's not like, I'm sure I've lived in London before, and people who are very wealthy in the United Kingdom to some extent or another, I mean, often they do look down on people who use the bus as opposed to drive their Mercedes to Knightsbridge every day. But London and the United Kingdom are naturally limited in how large they can be. The UK is, Britain is an island, and London is kind of has built up naturally. I mean, obviously
Yeah.
not naturally; it's a human settlement, but you know what I mean. It's a
Yeah.
settlement that's kind of existed since Roman times and around like 64 AD, and
Yeah.
slowly but surely it had to accommodate a slow growth, and that meant people living pretty close to each other. But then you have places like Los Angeles, which was not really a city in any sense until like 1880. You have unlimited land, and of course, it's a colonial mentality. Indigenous peoples have been living there for thousands of years. But I'm just speaking from the vantage point of American
Right.
urban planners. They see it as like, this is endless land. It's the most beautiful. I mean, California is the most beautiful geography on earth, and they thought, we could build so many, white picket fence houses. We could favor the local oil industry interests by funding it. And that's kind of different on the West Coast compared to the East Coast, because, Manhattan is kind of like London or Europe.
Yep.
Manhattan is naturally limited. That's why it's dense. And
Yeah.
even in the other, and not that like, unfortunately, most East Coast cities, they're still not, the public transportation is lackluster there. But the way their inner city core kind of works, it is still more dense, to the point that a lot of, like, just thinking of like Charleston, South Carolina, which is in the South, a lot of its urban planning is kind of more reminiscent of like a European style city, this type of city that can host like a really good public transport network. But in places like Phoenix, Arizona, I mean, it's not even remotely resembling what a city means in any conventional sense. It's a very weird and, settler colonial mentality of what a human settlement should be, i.e. just kind of like endless atomized little neighborhoods of houses that you can't really leave unless you own a scrap of metal to do so.
When will we, as human beings in general, will let go of the idea of a house on a plot, right? It is not sustainable, right? How much land are you going to occupy? How many forests are you going to destroy? I think expanding expanding horizontally is not sustainable way of expanding. I think we should be looking to expand vertically, right?
Of
More and
course.
more apartment cities should be the go-to way of living in the future.
Absolutely. And I think that I don't know if, not even just India, but even in Western Europe or just anywhere outside of the US, because it's not really a case in England or whatever either. In America, we have a really specific conception of what we call college towns, because in America, we build universities in a lot of the times in towns that literally have 600 people in a rural area. That's not a case in Britain. I mean, they have their universities are in cities or major towns. In America, we think of a college town, so to speak, as basically, and kind of looping this in back there, but yeah, just speaking on how I think that Americans could be sold on the idea of dense settlements and apartment living, is that people really idealize the college experience in America. I don't know if you know what American Pie is, or I would recommend that to any of you who are kind of interested in knowing what I'm talking about. There's a really idealized version of college life in America that definitely doesn't apply to most people who go to college, but it's still kind of seen as like the dream when you're in your early 20s to be in, a small town, you live near your campus and you get to walk to the bar with your friends just 3 blocks away. And someone made a good point on Twitter that Americans really love to idealize this dream version of a college life that has a little bit of merit to being the experience of some people, but not for anyone, mind you. But the main point is Americans like that dream because at their core, Americans, like other people, would like to live near places where they can go and shop and see their friends and drink. It's just that, then they get told that, oh no, it's communists to live in apartment housing. You need to, and it's like, no, people, even Americans, individualistic types, it's like, no, it's still really nice to be able to go and like walk and see your friends. And that's why New York is the best, is like unequivocally, in my opinion, the best place in America, despite like its faults, like every other place, is that you can pretty much do that in Manhattan and even in, the surrounding boroughs to some extent. But yeah, I definitely think that the main thing, and to get people to sign on to this dream of a future like this, is you just need to break the spell that it's freedom to sit in traffic for 40 minutes to
Yeah.
do menial tasks that you could easily reduce to a 2-block, like 5-minute walk if you just built cities better. And when I try to argue this with people, a lot of it is like, if you're in America, you just don't really get it. And I'm someone, like, I've always been obsessed with politics, but I'm from California. And even though, like, I supported, increased funding for public transportation when I've heard people advocate for it, I never truly understood what it would be like to live in a place where you didn't need to have a car until I lived in London. And then all of a sudden it clicked. And yeah, I think you just need to kind of break the spell of this, because it's horrible to have to drive this long for anything. I'm in a suburb of Los Angeles currently, and I'm actually lucky. There is a grocery store like where you can shop like in walking distance. It's just that it's literally only one, and then past that it's just endless rows of houses, and you can't even go to like, anything besides that as a community center, pretty much. But yeah, it's just kind of breaking the spell. And I think honestly, like, there's been kind of a push. It's called, do you know what the term NIMBY means? Not in my backyard. It's a really, it's an American term. Yeah, nimbyism. You'll probably see it if you, like, it's something that, like, you notice, like, when you hear people say it for the first time. NIMBY,
Right.
not in my backyard. It's usually people who are in, like, community organizations in cities where they're like, oh yeah, I support a homeless shelter, but just not in my backyard. Go build it in the neighborhood over there. And there's been a movement that has its flaws, which I won't get into because it's kind of nuanced, but there's something called Yes in My Backyard. And it's mainly people who are saying, yes, like, please, for the love of God, like, build dense, affordable apartments in my neighborhood. Like, please do not let it. So I think just kind of having that as a slogan, something that will mainly attract like professional middle class types, are kind of a good coalition for this.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's, there's a lot of limitations, and it's just kind of hard to show most people. It's just hard for the average American, including people I know who are very politically inclined and left wing, and I'm sure they would support, like, increased funding for public transport. It's just they can't really imagine it, because to them it's like, well, yeah, it's a bus, but I mean, that's cool to have a bus, but like, that just means you'll have to be in the bus for 40 minutes instead of the car to get somewhere. And I'm like, no, it means you have the bus and then you build the city, so you don't need to go 40 minutes. It means you exactly. And then for me, the other reason, since there's just such a fascination with Teslas in particular, and other forms of green technology, obviously, green cars are better for the environment than oil, like oil powered cars, and it's better than the petroleum industry. The issue is it's still not sustainable, because that just means, like, just in the case of Mexico City, which I think is a city, very similar to Los Angeles in terms of planning, very beautiful and absolutely lovely place. And I loved it when I visited, but it also does have the same sprawl pattern as LA and most American cities.
Right.
The issue is when you have, horizontal as opposed to vertical building, like in your terminology, that I think is pretty helpful. It's still bad for the environment, even if you have like electric cars, because that means like places that would otherwise, soak in water during floods or whatever, that means you have to build concrete on top of it. And in Mexico City's case, there's so much concrete because of its horizontal layout that even though it was built on top of a lake, that the Spanish, I don't know if you know the story of Mexico City, but it's also kind of an interesting one for that regard.
Right.
Mexico City is a place built on top of a lake, and in its waterbed, there's still a lot of water, but the city has to get all of its water pretty much from outside sources, like from an aqueduct, because the rain that goes in and floods the city, it's one of the most flood prone cities in the world, and most people don't know that. It just gets on the concrete. So it's like, no, you can't have we can't have green cars. You need apartments, and you need trains.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, and it just really is startling. And like, yeah, like I said, I've never been to India, and I don't know what it's like living in urban India or in a rural area. I mean, I've seen, in movies, I've seen where it shows like pretty extreme traffic congestion in Mumbai.
100%.
But I don't know the degree to which things are, but also Mumbai and most Indian cities have very large populations. And I don't know the degree to which their layout is like it in America, because in most American cities, you will literally, being back in California after living in New York, it's really startling when you'll literally walk through parking lots
Mm.
that could easily house 1,000 people if it was not even a skyscraper built on
Right.
it. If you just build it like normal, like Midtown, lower Manhattan
Yeah.
housing that was built like 100 years ago over there, it could literally house over like 1,000 people easily.
Right.
And when you think of just like, yeah, also I would say, like, and I'll let you ask more questions directly instead of just like going on this, but I would say I've been thinking a lot about this one tweet that talked about how a lot of the reasons, even though Americans love cars at face value, a lot of the reasons Americans hold anti-city animus and prefer to live in suburbs is because of reasons that associated with cars.
Mm.
I.e., cities are dangerous because the main way you're going to be put in danger in a city is through getting hit by a car. Cities
Mm.
are loud, and people complain about cities being loud. They're loud because of cars, including in cities like New York, where more people take public transportation. But still,
Yeah.
like, New York is, people talk about how loud New York is, and it's like, yeah, because even in Manhattan, there's just too many cars. There's way too much honking. There's too much driving. Cities are dirty. People complain about cities being dirty, and it's like, yeah, they're dirty predominantly because of cars. They're not mostly dirty because people leave trash on the side of the road instead of putting it in a trash can. It's because of pollution from cars. And it's like, I think there's so much, just overall, I think there's a lot of potential to show people that there's a better way. And, I know a lot of people from California who visit New York and fall in love with it and stuff,
Mm.
and want to live in a lifestyle like that. It's just really hard for most people to even envision this stuff in a country where bus stops are like literally sometimes on the side of highways with just like one slab of cement to step off.
Right.
It's obscene, and it's like, it's such an insanely deep cultural shift we need to have, just for climate reasons alone.
Right.
It's just super hard to get people to see it like that.
Yeah, literally, I mean, people should realize that if you kind of like skydive on London, right? Anywhere you land, there will be an underground
Mhm.
tube, any like at least in 3-4 miles of radius, right?
Oh
So,
yeah,
and there will be means of transport to get there, right? So that would be there. And I see sometimes I see the public transport tab of London from one end of the city, the other, it will be like 45 minutes, and on road it will be like 1.5 hour, right? But it's like the reverse in America. If I like take a look at something
absolutely.
in LA, right? For example, I was just looking at some university to downtown LA, and it was like 2.5 hours in public transport. It was like obscene. Whereas in cars it was like 40 minutes. But was it the same always in America? Was there any sense of public transport back in the day in terms of like trams or so on? How
Mhm.
was it back then? How is it now? You have obviously described how is it now, and like what happened in between, right? So how was
Mhm.
that transport killed, and how fossil fuel companies to sell more oil wanted the car companies to produce more cars, so that it's like this partnership between car companies and fossil fuel industry for more cars and more petrol consumption. Can you please tell us about all that cycle? What happened?
Absolutely. And even though I described kind of the cultural background behind why Americans in the modern day have been kind of sold on cars as individual freedom, I
Mm.
would be, kind of remiss to not also talk about the fact that this is kind of like a constructed ideology, because like 100 years ago in most cities they were actually more dense. There was this really disturbing
Mm.
picture showing, I think it was St. Louis, it showed a picture in black and white from 1910 versus now,
Mm.
and it showed it kind of like, it didn't look like Manhattan by any means, but it was like buildings next to buildings. And they put the photo next to modern day, and it's literally like one building, a side highway, and grass and stuff. So absolutely, there were a lot of tram projects in Los Angeles. There's in DTLA, like downtown Los Angeles. There's actually it's called Angel's Flight. It's really worth looking up to anyone listening. It's a
Uh-huh.
little artifact of early Los Angeles's public transport system before it was crushed
Mm.
by General Motors.
Mm.
And in a lot of everywhere in the world, to some extent, there's been a pushback against public transportation for means of social segregation. I don't know if you've ever heard the story of speaking of the underground, there was a interesting story of when people in the UK, in London during World War II, when Germany was bombing London, and they were staying, seeking refuge in the underground.
Yep.
A lot of conservative politicians were horrified because they were worried that poor people would start to talk to middle class and wealthy people, and that they'd form some kind of social solidarity.
Right.
And in America, it's more extreme than ever. You can literally look at documents where city planners advocate for sprawl as an explicit means for racial segregation, like
wow.
very in the most explicit terms ever. When you look at, like, I was reading about the Washington DC Metro, that's fairly new. It's only 1968 or so, but it's actually better than most US public transport systems. But I was reading how one of the biggest pushbacks was from, like, the chief planner of DC back then, who was, like, explicitly saying, like, no, this will cause too much racial integration. You can't have people taking trains. You need to have, like, an urban center of a working class Black population, and you need to have a middle and upper middle class white population outside the city center and suburbs. And a really good person to look at is Robert Moses, someone who, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but he's like, Robert Moses is probably, I'd go as far as to say, he's most important urban planner in the entire world of the last 150 years or so. And in the post-war New York, he wanted to literally just build a highway throughout Manhattan. And he was thwarted, thank God, from doing so. But he was able to influence how the rest of New York looks. So when you're on Long Island, I'm not sure if most people are familiar with Long Island outside of the US. Long Island is...
It's this big island which
the very
has...
Long Island.
Brooklyn.
Parts of New York. It has Queens.
Right.
Yeah, and I was visiting a friend in Long Island a few months ago. And yeah, when you get outside of Brooklyn and Queens, Long Island looks exactly like most of the US does. It looks like Texas. It's literally just endless sprawl. It's just, and I'm not, whenever you say stuff like that, people are like, think you're being like weirdly patronizing or something. And it's like, I'm not insulting the value of communities that exist there. I'm by no means insulting anyone who chooses to live in these areas. I lived in a pretty similar area growing up, like most Americans do. It's just that because I'm concerned, like, it's because I advocate for the welfare of working and middle class people, I would like for suburbs and cities to be built in ways where there's a community center outside of a Walmart. And so I would say, overall, Americans are kind of forced to accept it. And from there, the ideology in favor of it kind of came about pretty much.
Right. And what did the car companies do to kill the public transport? So they bought off all the companies' stocks of everyone who maintains these trams and public transport systems, and they just killed it.
It's mostly just like campaign finance stuff. I was actually reading old 1920s LA municipal election stuff, mostly because I was interested in seeing how socialist candidates back then were doing. But I was also, it naturally did go into talking about how motor companies were like hugely invested in municipal candidates to push through, candidates who would favor not just car culture per se. It's more so that, I don't know if you know what zoning is in an American sense. I'm not sure if that term has any connotation outside of it. Zoning is, we have multifamily zoning, meaning that you're allowed to build like an apartment house where you can have multifamily housing. In most of America, it's literally illegal to do so, like explicitly, including in California. Most places it is illegal, like quite literally, to build anything but single family housing. And we're finally shifting away from that in California. But in most cases, they usually just favor candidates who wanted to have single family zoning as kind of like a method to work around it. And from there, you build after that. And also the other thing I'd say is in a lot of cities, American cities have it's a really unique thing to just the US because of our decentralized system. We have completely different laws governing how cities even function. So in LA, we have it's called a strong council, weak mayor system. We have 15 city council members and a mayor who can't really do anything. The city council does most things. In New York, they have a much stronger mayor system. But in a lot of cities, especially small ones, they have called a council manager system, and they have basically like an unelected bureaucrat in most of these places called like the city manager. It's not a politician. I mean, they might run for something eventually, but in this, they're just like a bureaucrat who like has this extremely wide power to push for, you know, zoning and it's kind of like an unelected position. But I'd also say like, so it's that, and then also like kind of cultivating a culture of nimbyism that is basically you know, in like American city councils, I don't know, they have like city council meetings and a lot of these things where, you know, in small cities or whatever, there will be a push for something moderate. It'll be like, yeah, we'll build an apartment building. And then you get all these like, you know, it's mainly like old, like upper middle class white people. They go down there and they're saying like, no, we can't have that built there because it'll dilute the value of our property.
Right.
To build that over there. And it's subterraneous. It's just kind of a polite way of saying it.
Right.
And talking about it like that, in, you know, obviously the implication is kind of like preserving like a homogenous like racial composition in middle class areas. They don't want to live near Black people. They want to interact. It's crude to say, but most of these types, they effectively want to see and interact with Black and Latino people who work as service industry workers who serve them. And in a lot of places like this, because we have like de facto racial segregation in America till this day, in most white suburbs, you are likely going to interact with Black and Latino people primarily who are service industry workers who commute to that town every day. That's how most of the country works, including in like liberal suburbs in California. It's just kind of something where most people take it for granted. And for me, that, you know, especially in America, of having such like an awakening about like the need for racial justice in the last year, especially after George Floyd's murder, and just general conversations about social inequality. I think that talking about urban planning and talking about car culture is important because, like I said in the beginning, it's really intertwined with just broader questions of discrimination and social segregation. And, you know, to me, I think it's meaningful to address, like, just as an example of like racial inequality and stark socioeconomic disparities between white and Black people in America. I think it's also important to address how American city planners have kind of like forced this to be the case through like segregate, you know, de facto segregation in how people even live and where people live near, and why people, Black communities and Latino communities have what they call food deserts, where you can't find a grocery store within a 3-mile radius. The only place you can find food at is at like what we call convenience stores, where you just get canned goods. And that's, you know, that ties into the obesity crisis among, and you get where I'm going with this. So basically, like, I think it's really important to talk about car culture in relation to just other kinds of like socioeconomic disparities in America. And that absolutely includes race.
I mean, racism and real estate in America is a different podcast topic in itself. We can just go on and on. But this idea that you tell me that they don't want to mingle with people, and public transport enables and forces them to mingle with them, right? And the car culture doesn't. I think this issue must be on steroids in southern states or like red states, right? Because they have an infinite amount of land, so way too much land for single picket houses, which is something the marginalized communities cannot afford, and they will be the last people to get on a public transport system and, you know, sit alongside people who they don't want to sit with. So and of course their pride is connected. No wonder their pride is connected with cars, right? Bigger the better. Bigger the car, it's more American, you know. So can you talk about how it works in like the red America, so to speak?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about Texas in particular with that, because Texas is, and again, I don't really know what the connotation of Texas is. Usually when I talk about stuff on like international podcasts, I try to just kind of like explain the cultural subtext and stuff for people who aren't in America, just because I want it to be valuable. In America, Texas is the largest state in the contiguous US. It is kind of, the joke is that everything is big in Texas. That's what Texans embrace. Texas is the cultural heart of American conservatism. In reality, Texas is a swing state, though. Now it is
Almost.
Trump won. Yeah, basically, Trump won 51% of the state. Biden won around 48% of the state. And all the big cities, 4 out of 10 of America's largest cities, Austin, Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, are all in Texas. And they're all blue states. They're all solidly Democratic. They're predominantly people of color and also liberal white people. And they're really limited in what they can do. Like in Austin in particular, Austin is kind of famous for being as liberal as San Francisco. They're just really limited in what they can do with regard to public transportation because the state government basically prevents them from doing so. They cut off bus funding. They'll institute, rigid single family zoning laws to prevent them from building apartment buildings and stuff like that. So that's also just kind of the nature of how the decentralized US system really fucks over poor people and people of color, is that you have, cases of blue cities in Austin, blue cities in Texas like Austin being like extremely prohibited in what they can actually do.
Right.
And like in America, you have these obscenely massive cars. I don't really know if cars like this are manufactured in India. I imagine not, for, just because of the layouts of how they're so large. They're literally like just trying to think of
pickup truck.
This is dumb, but is feet as a unit of measurement used outside of America? Right. Is feet
kind of
okay, like I mean, there's literally like, I'm a 6 feet tall man. There are literally like 8 foot to 9 foot tall pickup trucks that do not see anyone when they're driving.
Right.
The predominantly most motor deaths in the US are caused by these. They should not be street legal in any way. It is insane that they are. But there is this is something that correlates with like American individualism. It correlates with masculinity for very obvious reasons.
Exactly.
And then from there, it, correlates with in the same way of like, not to get off topic, but I was talking to someone about how climate change denial is so potent in America because all the oil companies basically tied it to like, you're a sissy, you're a girl if you don't want to drive like a gas guzzling Hummer or this massive truck or whatever, it's masculine, or it's masculine to eat endless red meat. Americans love beef. Americans love cows. I don't eat beef at all, but it's so hard to get people to stop eating it because it's so deeply tied to, American senses of masculinity. And then from there, that ties into support for capitalism and opposition to social safety nets, basically saying like, if you're a real man, you'll provide for your family. Sure, you can't because you're legally not, you get paid a wage that can't possibly like afford to live a good life because your boss takes most of what you produce from you. But, you're not a real man if you take government assistance, whether that means welfare or just funding for social services. And and that's another way where it's like, car culture is such a good distillation of all these other like how the nastiest sentiment kind of gets so effectively kind of put together by people who want people to reject good things. And one of them is like, car culture, it's super massive appeal to masculinity and stuff like that. But it's like, I think in that sense, and just going back to like red states, it's like, it is obscene there. I mean, for most people, most like advocates have to fight for even basic stuff like bus services in these cities that have over a few 100,000 people. And it's just like,
speaking of buses and trains, right? So like, how do you commute from a city to city? Like, for example, if I'm living in Bangalore, I have a train to Hyderabad and I have like a bus to Hyderabad. I used to live in a little town. I have a bus to that little town from here. But I think the bus services, there is no such thing called a public bus service in America. Obviously, I think it is, I forgot the name of the bus service, and apparently it is mostly used by Black people because it's super cheap. And I was looking up for like two major cities of Texas, right? Dallas and Houston. I thought surely there has to be a train, and surprise, surprise, there is no train. And obviously, it is a perfect candidate for like something like a high-speed rail, which is huge, and it would reduce the transport time for more than half of what it would take in a car. And what is with this lack of rail network or public transport network, even among the cities, right? Like intercity transport is also kind of pretty poor. And usually, I think you would either get around in a car or in a flight if it's too far, which is totally not sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say like in the South, in red states, I can't even begin to imagine how bad it is. In the Northeast, you usually can. It's not as good as Japan or Europe by any means, but you can usually get a train from you can definitely get a train from like New York City to Boston. Boston also has actually pretty good public transport, but I'm thinking even like you can get a train from New York to places like Baltimore, and Baltimore doesn't have really good public transport in the city, but they still have like links to there. But just thinking of like, in a lot of these places, they do have, it does exist to some extent. It's just that it's like, when working class Americans regularly have to work 3 jobs, work 60 hours a week, it's obscene to ask, like, for very obvious reasons. It's like, it is cheaper to spend a shit ton of money on a car and then have to pay for petrol and car insurance and all that and maintenance than it would be to spend like 4 hours as much time trying to see the one time a day when a bus service works or whatever.
Yeah.
And like California, like I said, like California is very much built on car culture, but we still have better funding for the public transport we do have than like Texas or the red states. I don't know anyone who has ever, I've never gone on a train from LA to San Francisco. I've always taken a plane. It's a 1 hour plane flight. I don't know anyone who, it might exist. I'm pretty sure there's some method of like really slow rail from there, but it's like, yeah, you take a plane from LA to San Francisco. It's like, and there's been huge talks in California, especially of like, yeah, we need a high speed rail from San Francisco to LA. Cause it's absolutely obscene that we don't have it. It's like, can you imagine like, not having a train from Manchester to London, or like, I don't know, like I'm thinking of like Tokyo to
Kyoto,
Kyoto, or like Hiroshima and like much more south down there. You can't. And it's like, it's absurd that there's no high speed rail. Unfortunately, usually politicians articulate it in really like dumb nationalist way. They'll be like, oh, we're going to lose to China if we don't have like high speed rail like they do. So it's usually appealing to kind of like offensive, like nationalistic nonsense, but like at least they're pushing for it. And like, yeah, if you want to have high speed rail, I think you would kind of have to have it regionally, just because America is huge. You kind of need to have like the Pacific corridor. There should be a, linkage from Seattle to Portland to San Francisco to Los Angeles. Then, bolster it in the Northeast, do stuff in the South. It's kind of hard to have like stuff in the Midwest where it's less populated, but like America, it's the wealthiest country on earth. It's kind of, there's such little political imagination. We could have better, people love Japanese transit. We could have better, that if we had the political will for it, America could have the best transit on earth by far. I mean, we could have like stuff that makes the London Underground look terrible easily. It's just, there's no political will for it, really.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking. America, the most prosperous, the most wealthiest, most innovative, creative nation on earth, right? But Japan, unlike the rest of the world, got far ahead with its high-speed rail, and they did it back in the 60s, right? And Europe caught up later, and you would think US is as big as a size in Europe, and not as dense, obviously, but you would think there should be at least a pocket of high-speed rail, as you said, at least between the major cities. I really thought Texas would really have that between these 4 major cities, like one single high-speed rail line that can take between cities in 1 hour or 2, right? So, what is the excuse here? Is size the only excuse? Why is it so expensive? Because I was also reading that it is less expensive to build high-speed rail or public transport in Europe than it is to build in US. So why is that so?
Yeah, so that's the other thing is like, just trying to gather my thoughts, but yeah, it's a good point of how like, I do see people push back. They're like, well, actually America's way physically bigger than Japan. And it's like, we're not comparing the US to Japan. I'm comparing, California geographically to Japan, maybe. I'm comparing the US geographically to the European Union, which does not have, there's obviously asymmetries in how good public transit is per country, but I mean, infinitely better. You can obviously take a train from
Berlin to Madrid or whatever,
Absolutely. And it's like, yeah, a lot of it is like that, but yeah, it's mostly because people can't comprehend it. Like, it really is something where it doesn't really make sense. It's not even just because people like cars. It's just that it doesn't make sense to how you could have it trained, because the places where they live, to them it's like, okay, well, taking a train just means I have to go to a train station, and that will take me as long to get from there to where I want to go as a car. But it's like, no, because you need to have trains, and then also build the cities to accommodate trains. You need to have denser city building. And for most people, they can't understand that unless they visited New York when they were a kid, or studied abroad in Berlin or whatever. But a
Right.
lot of it is just complete lack of imagination. Most Americans don't use public transit. There is the subtext that public transit is not for white people. I mean, it's kind of just that simple. When you're in Orange County, California, where
Mm.
I'm from Newport Beach, which is like uber. I don't come from a super rich background myself, but it is a super ultra affluent white, lily white Republican city. And the OC bus service, Orange County bus service, it's very obvious that the subtext is that this is for immigrant workers, usually
Mm.
Mexican or Central American, who do work as, either service workers at like the local like Subway sandwich restaurant, or clean the people's houses. I mean, that's kind of the subtext. And usually, like, when you talk to someone who opposes public transportation enough, it'll slip and they'll say something kind of like that. They'll say like, yeah, we don't want those people here. They usually
Mm.
hide it through, polite language. But yeah, eventually kind of the mask slips and they'll say something to that effect, that it will dilute the quality of our community. It'll hurt property values, stuff like that.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, so for most people, going on a bus is like, because there are some people who can kind of like appreciate trains in the abstract, even if they've never taken a train as like a thing to travel on in any meaningful sense, outside of like a vacation they took to New York where they took the
Mm.
subway. But buses are considered dirty. I mean,
Right.
that is the connotation. It's dirty, and the racial implication there is like pretty obvious with regard to that. But it's like, yeah, people don't take buses. There's a massive amount of poor people who actually could afford bus services and stuff in areas where it exists, but they're kind of told that like, oh, if you take a bus, then you're really
Mm.
poor. You can at least, pretend to be middle class if you have a car. And there's such deep, extreme shame along, surrounding being poor in America, where the myth of social mobility, and that we're, a classless society. We don't have
Mm.
landed gentry like Europe did. So that means everyone who wants to be an entrepreneur can become that. When sentiment like that is really strong, the idea of looking poor is such a stigma to avoid. And people
Right.
will just not take buses, even in the areas where they can, pretty much.
Mm. and and because of this sense of shame, right? Because of this lack of public transport, like, it can really decide the prosperity of a place, right? Mobility is very
Mhm.
important within the city, right? And the people who live without with the public transport, they would save a lot of money on car and petrol. That would actually improve their lives. So
Yeah.
at the eventual net outcome of that is a positive outcome, and it's just that it really needs a good sales team to sell that thing. And
Mhm.
obviously a lot of shame has to be washed away from the public transport. It's not shameful to, like, I have seen
Of
like
course.
big celebrities and CEOs take public transport in London in the tube. I have
Oh,
literally
yeah,
seen
yeah.
cricketers, they take because it's convenient,
In New
right?
York, yeah, yeah, of course.
Right. This anti city sentiment, right? Because, like, people who don't belong in our class live there, so they don't have to mix with us. So all
Mhm.
this coming together is what is keeping America this car addicted society, is what you're trying to get to.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it, pretty much in like a, as simply as possible. That so
Hmm.
much of America's lack of public transport infrastructure is just so intimately related to like every really ugly social phenomena, and that absolutely, if predominantly, includes racism.
Right.
And yeah, that I agree with that.
Right. What can it learn of? There is a lot to learn for America from, like, European and Japanese public transport, right? So what what are the things that are absolutely possible, but are not happening because of the simplest of willpower among the politicians,
Mhm.
right? So what are the most simplest things that America can get and see, but it's not seeing right now?
Yeah, I think that I mean, for one, just, just circling back to just the basics of it, is that in America, I believe there is literally only one city of any size that has a majority of people that use public transport daily, and that's New York City. And even then, I think it's like 60%. There's still people in like the outer boroughs who drive a
Right.
lot, obviously.
Right.
Then after that, it's like Chicago, I think it's like above 30%. Same with DC, San Francisco. But then LA is like 10% max, I'm pretty sure. I could be getting the figures wrong, but like even if I'm slightly wrong with the numbers, I mean, the sentiment is like basically the same. And just understanding that you can easily have many, many cities, even smaller, medium-sized cities that don't need skyscrapers. They just need 3-story buildings, and they need it so that there's not 5 lanes of traffic in between them and stuff. The one other thing I'd just circle back, not to go back to one of the previous topics, because I think there's also another methods of like how we can learn from Japan or China or Europe on this. I think another really interesting thing about how people talk about urbanism versus suburban lifestyle that's really interesting, and I should have touched upon it, is there's an illusion of nature. There's an illusion of nature that has to do with suburbs. That is completely deranged. They talk about suburbs as, in America, we have homeowners associations that you're kind of if you buy a house in suburbs, you're kind of forced to be in a homeowners association where you pay your dues, and they literally like they punish members who try and paint their house a shade of beige. That's I'm not even joking. They're really strict on this stuff. But the one thing about it is that like we have really strict laws with regard to, or ordinances really, because they're enforced by these, which aren't even government, about lawns. People really like lawns. Americans, I don't know if people have lawns in America. I don't know if people have like lawns, like this type of artificial like grass monoculture outside.
We don't have that much land, but go on.
It's literally just like people sincerely think that it's the biggest waste of water ever. It's not nature. It's actually destroying nature. It takes all the water for this like ugly, just monotonous green, like imported, that destroys all the native agriculture. Americans think that suburbs are nature. They really think that when you have these lawns, that as your pastime after you get home from your middle class job as an insurance salesman, that you go and mow the lawn, and that your wife and kids will think you're the man of the house for mowing the lawn, and that it's nature. But New York City, that's anti-nature. But it's like, no, if you want to conserve nature, you have some areas where you build a lot of stuff for people, and then you leave the rest to be natural. If you build everything horizontally, then there's no nature. Seeing green does not mean it's nature. It's not Phoenix, Arizona, there is no natural green monoculture that needs to have like an entire aqueduct for like one neighborhood to be able to like. And there's also, I don't know, do people play golf in India?
Yeah, I mean,
people like golf.
Yeah,
golf is like the worst. I don't care if people enjoy golf or what. I don't care about it on its value, but golf is like in California. There's literally cities where like a majority in small cities. There's like cities where, and we're in a natural desert where we have constant droughts. There's all these cities where like a majority of one city's water use is for one golf course.
Wow.
This is like, and you can't tell people that this is ridiculous, because even if they don't play golf, they drive past it and they see a really large lawn, basically, with a few imported trees, usually palm trees, because they want to give it the California aesthetic. They really think that's nature. They think that they're pioneers crossing the Mississippi River to build a new land in like uncharted area. It's really just this weird settler colonial fantasy that this is nature. It's not. There's no grass, like this weird grass. It's not in Arizona. That's ridiculous. But yeah, that's the other thing about it is I would say that Americans need to desperately learn that this is not nature at all. What's actually nature is like in London, where they have the green belts. After in post-war Britain, they had a really good planning policy where they kind of naturally limited how suburbs could develop, because places like London and Birmingham, they had mandated green belts where they would just have very, very little development. So they don't have like this endless suburban sprawl. That's actually where nature is. Lawns are not only not nature, they're actually like horrifically destructive to the environment. But yeah, I think that's the other thing is like, it's basically these people really think when they're driving 30 minutes from their suburban sprawl house built in 1970 to a Walmart, they really think it's nature because they see a few trees and then like lawn. And it's like, that's not nature. If you want nature, you have places like New York City and you surround it with the actual environment.
Leaving the Arizona as it is also nature. That is what nature is. The idea of nature
Exactly.
is so white European centric that everything should be
Yeah,
green.
exactly.
Green is the
Uh,
beautiful nature, and desert is like the harsh nature, and that's just,
exactly.
you
Yeah,
know.
I think that's a good way of putting it. So yeah, that's why I kind of talk about like really deep, people kind of sometimes talk about colonialism in like almost abstract senses. And I think there's some merit to that in academic circumstances. But this is one where I think it's actually really meaningful because it really is like a colonial fantasy. And I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
mean that as like a white person saying this in like a white guilt way or whatever, but I actually do think like that is the most distilled version of like contemporary attitudes in American society that is
right.
absolutely rooted in colonialism. Is like, yeah, like thinking that like saguaros and like the cactuses and desert aren't nature. That's a wasteland. What's
Yeah,
actually nature is when you build a one-story house that you put like a lawn in front of and then import a palm tree and then take up like 70% of that city's water supply
right.
every year, just like, maintaining it. And it's absurd.
and 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 also you don't have the concept of terrace itself, right? Because in India, terrace is like big. You need a terrace where you can sit, relax, fly kites. For you, the lawn is the terrace, but what you don't realize is the amount of land and the amount of water that you put to make that lawn beautiful, right?
Mm-hmm.
I see that is exactly how I feel when I see a golf course in Dubai. I'm like, how are you maintaining
Oh
this?
yeah.
Maintaining European like cities in the middle of a desert is just so polluting and like so
Exactly.
carbon expensive, if that's the way to put it, you know.
Mm-hmm. And I'd say like, yeah, I completely agree with that.
And also like uh, we were talking about this example of another how public funded endeavors are uh, deliberately made to fail in order to make them look even more bad, right? And you were
Yeah.
talking about the example of a St. Louis city. I totally forgot the name of the
Yeah,
city.
it was called the Pruitt-Igoe housing
Right,
projects.
right.
Do you use the term housing projects in India to call public housing? Like, what is it called there?
It is just public housing, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, in like England they use like social housing and
Right,
stuff.
right.
Yeah, just thinking of like terms and stuff.
Mm,
But yeah, it was basically like just for the gist for viewers. So in St. Louis in the 20th century, they kind of built the first famous example of public housing. It was actually kind of really celebrated at first. They actually got this Japanese architect who later won like an international award. I forgot what
yeah,
it
I
was
think he
called for
designed
it.
the World Trade Center, wasn't did he?
Yeah, I think so. So it
Yeah.
was, yeah, at first there was some excitement around it. Um, and it was really interesting. I talked about it with you, but there's actually more stuff I was thinking about it after our conversation, how it also just ties into just layout in general.
Right.
So St. Louis, for people who aren't really familiar, I don't know how well known St. Louis is outside of the US. It was
Mm,
always in the 20th century. They used to have this like in the 20th, like mid 20th century, back when America was expanding, there was this obsession for there to be a Western New York. Western at the time
mm,
meaning central now. They didn't have a
right, right.
Pacific coast. So that's why, not to go off topic, but just as a funny novelty, if you ever look at it, why there's a bunch of cities called like Paris, Iowa, or
Mm, mm,
London, Ohio, or
right.
Madrid, or Athens or whatever. It's all because it was these like industrial titans who lived in New York who were saying
Mm,
like, oh, this is going to be the Western New York. And
mm,
then by the end, it became St. Louis and Chicago looked like they were, one of them was going to be the Western New York.
right.
Chicago won out, and so St. Louis declined. By the 20th century, St. Louis was already kind of deindustrializing quicker than the rest. It was
Mm,
already, not to insult anyone who lives in St. Louis, but in the context of like,
mm,
historiography, kind of St. Louis was seen as a place in decline. And so it attracted a lot of working class Black residents from the South during the what we call the Great Migration period of
right.
Black people in the 20th century moving out of the South up north in search of
Mm,
civil liberties and also just way better economic conditions.
right.
And all of a sudden they had, we call it tenement housing. It's kind of a polite term for slums. So we had these
Mm,
slums in St. Louis And there was an urban renewal effort to build public housing that would be better than these slums that kept lighting on fire. There were actually a bunch of like, horrifically, there were literally white tenement housing owners who would burn them down and kill the people inside to get
Oh my
insurance
God.
settlement. It's barbaric stuff. And I think that
Right.
that's why, like, you know, urban history is so deeply important to understanding some of those ugly, you know, incidents in American history.
Mm, mm.
Anyway, basically they're like, we should build public housing. It was one of the first efforts. It even got the support of some businesses, interestingly, because they wanted to
Right.
make downtown St. Louis
Mm.
palatable and stuff, you know, to
Right.
commercial interests. So they built Pruitt-Igoe housing. At first, it was celebrated. Like you said, it was built by, I believe, like the architect who built the World Trade Center. It got a bunch of
Right.
awards. It wasn't really public housing though, because its construction was funded.
Mm.
It was not maintained through public funding though. It was maintained through the tenants of this,
Rent.
and they were Black public housing tenants
Right.
in 20th century American South. It is
Right.
among the poorest people in the country at the time,
Right.
obviously. And so for that reason, it quickly fell into disrepair.
Mm.
And there was also just the fact that a lot of, and what I didn't touch upon in our conversation was, even besides just the obvious factors of Black working class people being subject to like horrific discrimination in job searches, as in every other facet of life,
Mm.
it was also because it was in the downtown. But despite that, it was so far away from the jobs because it was already,
Right.
St. Louis is already turning into a sprawl city. So the people literally couldn't even get to jobs
Mm.
that would hire them, even if like factories and other industrial settlements that were more open to having like a multiracial workforce, they couldn't go there because there was no public transit. There were no real consistent trams, and they couldn't
Yeah.
afford cars, obviously, if you're a public housing resident.
Right.
So basically, like, yeah, Pruitt-Igoe is set to fail. I don't know if there's a really, so yeah, it was set to fail and it went into disrepair. Naturally, it became a site of extreme poverty, and that
Right.
led to organized crime organizing in the building, and that,
Right.
you know, led to conservatives saying like, oh yeah, this is why public housing can't work.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Oh, and you know, not to get too on to that, but there's also like, and again, I'm saying this and I put this as a preface because I don't know if like certain like really bigoted American sentiments have any, you know, if they have like any meaning to someone outside of America. So I'm adding the preface of this. In
Right.
America, one of like, there's a really deep racist sentiment talking about where, you know, it's this like really deep like manifestation of like racial animus where they say Black people don't know their own parents. And that's what
Right.
people will say. And that's when conservatives are like, oh, the problem is in Black communities. The reason they're poor isn't because of like systemic discrimination. It's
Mm.
because there's no strong cultures of fatherhood. And someone made a really good point, I forget which scholar, was that places like Pruitt-Igoe, which were public housing predominantly for Black working class people,
Right.
they literally banned the fathers from being in there if they were able-bodied. So they were literally
Wow.
like, so American society kind of like, at least among like very large, not all, but among large sections of like the Black urban working class in the 20th century, they kind of
Right.
instituted policies that like literally forced the fathers from out of the house. And that is why they have, to this day, you have racist people saying this about how Black people don't know their own parents. And it's like, not that it's true to begin with, but the reason that this like hateful stereotype came about was because of stuff put in place in public housing to
Yeah.
basically make the environments as punitive as possible so that no
Mm.
one would want to live there. Because, and also they do literally inspections. It was strictly enforced. They'd inspect it. They'd ask the moms if they had any man staying over within a 7-day period, and they would kick them out if so. They would literally go into closets
Right.
to see if anyone was hiding. This was rigidly enforced. And yeah, it's kind of like a negative feedback loop. You do stuff like this, you negatively impact generations of people, then you create like crude, like bigoted stereotypes around it to condemn them. Even, yeah, you get where I'm going with this. And like it circles back into like why urban history is so deeply important to understanding everything else about American life.
Right. 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 Man, I think I've got to learn more about why the cities are the way they are in US, and
Uh-huh.
it is not exactly the utopian dream American life that it seems to be, right? It only
Mhm.
it first of all, it is unsustainable, and it is only available for few people, and
Yeah.
it is not supposed to be that way. I think there should be a sense of equality where everyone exists and everyone has the equal access to like mobility and jobs and to move.
Yeah.
And I think transport is a massive factor in deciding which area prospers and which area doesn't, right? So
Mhm.
cars, that is like a tourist's nightmare to visit America. Is like you have to hire a car to go anywhere,
Oh yeah, yeah.
which is like so. And and obviously, if as a tourist, if I can feel it, and I can only imagine how people over there who actually work feel. So I just hope,
Yeah.
I don't know when it will get better, bro, but
Yeah.
I hope there are some steps in that
Mhm.
direction.
I'll just add, if I could add one more comment for this ends.
Right.
It's actually funny. I have a friend from India. I knew her in New York.
Mm,
Then when I went back to California during the start of COVID, she actually ended up back there. She was dating a person she knew from India who goes
right.
to University of Southern California. And I remember talking to her, and she's from Mumbai. And I remember like talking to her, and she was really confused why the LA Metro didn't seem to go anywhere. Like it was on time. It was actually clean. It just, you can't really go anywhere. It's just all way too spread out and stuff. And like, yeah, I imagine if you're like from like a urban center in India, that's kind of the experience outside of like any city but New York in America,
Mm,
pretty much.
yeah, yeah, true, true. Well, that was a fascinating topic, Aiden.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for your time.
Of
I've
course.
learned a lot, and I hope listeners felt the same. And on that note, we tell you goodbye, and until we see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.